Quiet down now. Okay.
Good to see you, John.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. So how have you been? What's it been, like 2-3 weeks since we had our last?
It's been something like that. Yeah, things are good. Busy, but no place I'd rather be tonight than chatting patristics chat, or what is it called? Patristic chat?
Cast.
Oh, cast, right.
I had recommended Patcast, and you said, no, that sucks. And then you said, well, how about Patristicast? And I said, well, yeah, that's better, but I can't let Don get the last word in, so I had to change it a little bit.
We should have our 10 subscribers vote, and
we got 15 now,
and tell you that you should have left it as Patristicast, because that was awesome.
It is a little bit better, actually, now that I think about it.
That's all right.
So anyway, important topics. Did you watch the World Juniors at all?
Nope.
Do you ever watch that?
No. What's that have to do with patristics? That's all I live, breathe, and...
It's only the second greatest tournament in the history of the world.
Yeah, well...
Sorry about what happened in the gold medal game, though. U.S. beating Canada pretty bad.
That's the only reason you brought it up. I know. That's okay.
I know. Had Canada won that game, I would have ignored it at all costs.
Yeah. That's all right.
Yeah, have you been doing any writing or anything? You doing any research at all right now, or are you just...
What am I doing right now? Well, it's probably the same thing if you asked me this before, editing that chapter for my paper on Irenaeus and the Imago Dei, as we talked about last week. So we're supposed to work on that today. Didn't get much done, so it's all right.
That's the Oxford one.
No, that one's all done.
Okay.
This one was the Lyon conference.
The Lyon conference, right? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
How about you? What are you working on?
Just submitted an abstract for the Origeniana conference next August, which is in Munster. Let's see. I'm revising a paper for a journal right now. Got some comments back, so I'm just in the revision process. I think they give me like 2 months to get them back, so I have till the end of February. And then I've been trying to set up interviews for our channel here.
Oh, I thought you were going to say job interviews. I was getting excited there.
No such luck yet. But there's not much out there either, so.
No.
But we got some good interviews lined up. Got John Kloppenborg coming on Friday. Really excited about that. He's his book. It's an excellent exploration into these early Christian groups. These first century groups that where Paul was writing to in Corinth and Thessaloniki. What were these people up to? How did they fit in the world around them?
This Friday with John Kloppenborg. What time?
Well, the interviewing him starting at 3, should probably have it uploaded 4:30, 5 o'clock-ish, somewhere around there.
Hey, does this, apropos of nothing, does this sound familiar if I were to say, John Kloppenborg, this Friday, 5 o'clock, don't you dare miss it?
Works for me.
Does that expression sound familiar? Don't you dare miss it.
No.
No? Oh, come on, man. You're as old as me. I thought it was an old wrestling announcer from the 80s. And he'd say, this week, Saturday night special, Hogan versus Ted Bundy. Don't you dare miss it.
I was, no, I don't remember that. Although I do remember watching professional wrestling. I think we watched it, I think it was Sundays after Mass for about a half hour. But that kind of reminds me, though, it is apropos of this discussion, as a matter of fact, because we're talking about prayer tonight, which is no small subject.
I'm curious how you're going to segue wrestling to prayer. Go
no,
on.
Not wrestling. The 80s. is how I'm connecting
see.
this.
Do you need to lock your chair the other way as well, John?
Okay, I can swivel, but I can't rock. I have this memory, one of my earliest memories of prayer, which may or may not be true, but it's one of the earliest. It must have been about 10 or 11. We were in Alexandria, so it was at least the winter of 1988. And we were in the first house we lived in Alexandria, which means it was probably no later than the winter of 1990. But late February every year is when high school hockey, they have their section tournaments.
Oh, so we're not talking about Africa here.
We're not talking about Africa here. We're talking about Minnesota here, Alexandria, Minnesota. And late February every year, they have their section tournament to see who goes to the state tournament, which is the greatest tournament in the world. And at that time, there were 8 sections. And our family had just moved from Moorhead to Alexandria. And I loved Moorhead high school hockey, the Spuds. I was a huge fan. So every February, even after we moved, I would, hope that they would make the state tournament because I wanted to see them play. They'd never been there before. And I have this memory, one year before the news would come on, the guy still does it. Randy Shaver, what's called Prep Sports Extra. And when it comes to like the spring tournament season, he always has this like 5 or 10 minute segment after the regular news where he reports on all the different tournaments and what teams are winning and this and that. And I went into my parents' room and I like stood in front of the cross that they had hanging on their wall. And I prayed so hard that Moorhead would win the Section 8 championship so I could watch them play in the state tournament.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about that actually as I was thinking about prayer in the early church, because they would have looked at me and said, "You're an idiot." Of course, they would have recognized that I was just like 10 or 11 years old at the time.
No, they still would have said it.
Well, naturally, they'd probably still say it today.
No,
they were talking to me. But one of the things that the writers I'm thinking of for tonight are concerned with is trying to get their readers and their audiences to understand that that's not what prayer is about. You don't pray for, good things to happen to you. Well, at least those kinds of good things. These kind of mundane, silly things. And every time I think about that, praying for Moorhead to win, I kind of get a chuckle and I say, that wouldn't have worked back then. But
what was the final score? I mean, you have to tell me now.
They didn't make it that year. And I think, I can't remember the first year they made it. It was 1990.
Don't get carried away here with the question. Seriously.
No. 91 or 92, I think, was the first year they made it. Okay. Jason Blake, I don't know if you remember him. He played a lot of years in the
Yeah, Jason Blake, sure.
He was on the first Moorhead team that went to the state tournament. So that's a segue into prayer.
Okay.
So what's going on with the prayer in the early church?
Yeah, that's actually funny you bring that up. I had a prospective PhD student email me recently. I've never said that before.
The hell is he emailing you for?
Quite right. Didn't even sound serious when I said it. Oh, that's good. Anyway, for whatever reason, he did. And he, well, I don't know, maybe like me, he also is a minister. And, he had seen some of my things on early church and spirituality. So that's how he found me. And he asked me a very interesting question. He He asked if my study of the early church had specifically contributed or shaped my own prayer life.
Hmm.
And I thought, well, that's a very good question. So, I wrote back to him and said a few things, but it did get me wondering specifically about Irenaeus, because as you know, it's really the only thing I know much about. So, of course, I was thinking, well, what did Irenaeus say? Because technically, my dissertation is about issues of spirituality. You'd think I'd be able to quickly answer that.
Prayer is kind of an important issue in Christian spirituality.
Yes, you'd think. So it actually shocked and disappointed me when at first I thought to myself, what does Irenaeus say about prayer? I had to look it up. Now, in my defense, here will be my weak defense anyways. In my initial plan for my dissertation, I was going to have a section on prayer, and I ended up going in a different direction as we talked about. So I didn't dedicate a lot of energy to it. But I'm almost glad I didn't, because I've now revisited that idea, looked at it, and was very surprised to discover that Irenaeus really says very, very little about prayer. He mentions, prayer in the New Testament several times, many times. But there's actually, in Against Heresies, only 2 times that I quickly found where he talks about his prayers or any kind of prayer as part of a spirituality. And those 2 times are when he talks about his heart for the heretics and that he prays that they would repent. Those are his only 2 references.
How kind of him.
Yeah, about his own prayer, or like he never exhorts his readers to prayer. So that's just his writing. But again, considering he wrote more than anyone else in the 2nd century, I expected to find a little more there.
Mm-hmm.
So that surprised me a little bit. I suspect, now I know Origen and Clement, they both had a fair amount to say, did they not, about prayer?
I can't speak too much for Clement of Alexandria. Origen, yes, because Origen has a treatise, a fairly lengthy treatise on the subject of prayer. And you can kind of see several different things that early Christians were debating in the 3rd century. And so his treatise was written, or perhaps dictated through a lecture at the request of his patron Ambrose, who asked him to write this treatise on prayer and to respond to several different objections to prayer. And I think there are like 4 or 5. I can't remember the exact number of objections that were listed, but all of them had something to do with God's foreknowledge and providence. So if God foreknows what's going to happen, if God is provident and makes things happen as he wills, there's no point in prayer. Because if you're going to pray for something that's going to happen anyways, or that's never going to happen regardless of what you do, then there's no point in prayer. And Origen spends a lengthy amount of time at the beginning of his treatise refuting that, and he goes into a discourse that is almost verbatim with the discourse he has in the 3rd book of On First Principles, where he talks about human freedom, and he distinguishes the sources of movement in different beings. So inanimate objects, for example, can only be moved from outside of themselves. Like a stone can't move unless somebody picks it up and moves it. ensouled beings, so animals, even to some degree plants, can be moved from within themselves, but only through I think he kind of says something like natural impulses. If in On First Principles, he says, if a spider, has an image appear of weaving a web, its natural response is to weave the web. There's not a rational process that goes into that weaving of the web. It has the image, it responds. Rational beings, which humans are a rational being, have this intellectual capacity to take in stimuli from outside or even from inside, images that appear in the mind, and make rational judgments about it. So they're able to judge, is it good, is it bad, is this what I should do, is that what I should do, and kind of make moral decisions before they act. And so having set out human freedom in that way, he then goes on to talk about one of the benefits of prayer is that it teaches the person to cultivate a certain disposition of the soul, because at prayer, the person is in his or her most intimate contact with God. And so they have to create a sort of an internal disposition that orients them to that encounter. But that's not just psychological in a way. It's he has a pretty clear connection with ethics there. So if you are, you can't come to prayer angry, for example, or having resentment towards your friends and neighbors. So before you come to prayer, you need to make amendments. You need to either forgive somebody who has wronged you or seek the forgiveness if you have wronged somebody before you have come to prayer. You have to, I shouldn't say you have to. I mean, it's not, but that's the best way to come to prayer.
Is this connecting prayer to the freedom of the will? Is that the connection here with the ethic side of it?
Well, that's how he first really dispenses with this notion that human events are preordained and therefore prayer doesn't have an impact. He says, no, that's nonsense. We're responsible for what we do.
Right, but I'm wondering if there's also a connection here. Like you speak of the wrong against the brother or any other ethical aspect of it, and that made me think of, again, that unique feature of our rationality of we have the freedom of the will, but since we now want to, trying to remember how you spoke of that encounter, the language of the encounter, but since we also desire that, prayer, in a sense, is us needing to deal with the implications of the freedom of our will, almost. If you follow me there. I thought maybe that's where you were going. I thought you had this grand scheme.
No, I mean, he uses that argument on freedom. And the term he uses, it's a Stoic phrase, to ephemen, that which is up to us. So things that we do are within our control. So whether good things happen or bad things happen, some of those things are out of control, but the kind of actions we do are within our control. So when we come to prayer, first, through the practice of virtue, helps us get oriented for prayer. But then that in and of itself has the ethical implications, because it teaches us that prayer has a direct connection with how we treat other people. if that makes any sense whatsoever.
A little bit.
Yeah. So it's quite interesting. You think that was the philosophical objection, and that's coming from Gnostic communities like Valentinus, Basilides, these sort of fringe groups who tended to see God as fixed and immovable, and human beings as unchangeable as well in a certain respect. Either they had a good nature or a bad nature, and there wasn't anything anybody could do about it.
Mm-hmm.
But you also see, Origen grappling with this. Like, I think we can all probably relate, anybody who has prayed will know that at the time of prayer, it's awfully difficult to concentrate the mind, especially when somebody's under a lot of stress. So Origen will talk about how oftentimes mental images or memories will appear at the time of prayer that are really distractions. This is part of this has a connection, I think, to the ethical implications of prayer, because what he seems to be getting at in this treatise is the things, that, if we have a resentment towards a friend or a neighbor, that's going to bother us at the time of prayer. If we don't set things right with those around us, for example, we're going to be vulnerable to these distractions. And then our prayer is just unprofitable because being too distracted, we can't focus our mind on the prayer itself. So that was another thing that kind of emerges in this treatise, is not what to do before the prayer, not how to prepare oneself, but even what happens during the act of prayer and how to keep your mind focused. And he's not really concerned too much in the treatise with trying to navigate that problem. How do you stay focused on it? As much as he is just kind of talking about it as a problem. Whereas a century later in the monastic communities of Egypt, you see them grappling with that problem and trying to come up with concrete solutions for coping with those distractions.
Was it Origen or Clement that, or both maybe, that spoke of the best practices or his recommendation? And I know he wasn't the first about standing and facing east or upward and eyes open.
Yep, that's another thing, and that's in Origen's treatise. It's primarily at the end where he has kind of guidelines. He does talk about the ideal posture, bodily posture for prayer is standing, facing the east, and having your arms out in the orans position. And the facing the east was Christological, because you're facing the sun, the rising of the sun, which is sort of symbolic of the resurrection of the Son, of Jesus. And you see, he talks a little bit about, he brings up the hypothetical question that someone might raise, that, well, what if your house isn't really facing east, but the sun is out and you can open up the door and get sunlight in that way? So you kind of get the sense that some people were saying, well, do you really have to face east? Because there are these practical things. And if how many churches today are actually facing east or ad orientem? Not too many of them anymore. And he kind of says, yeah, I understand that hypothetical scenario, but it's still better even if your house doesn't face east, to face yourself towards the east, because really the rising of the sun is the important symbol, not the sunlight that might come in through a window or a door.
Yeah. I found it very interesting when I first came upon that, like I say, a couple of years ago, because for me, my own background or lack thereof, if you asked me, what's the pious position of prayer, I would have just said, well, I don't know, on your knees. What else is there, really? And so I've actually often practiced that, and I find that standing, that is,
Mm-hmm.
facing as near east as I can figure, and
Mm-hmm.
in the Iran's position, as you say, and I do find it quite helpful, because it really does force you to be more focused, in a sense.
Yeah.
Especially, and I do like also that you're engaging, the body as well,
Mm-hmm.
and the symbolism even of just standing there, and the symbol of the cross
Yeah.
is quite interesting. And I would have, I think reading Origin was the first time I'd come across that, and so I find that quite valuable, for sure.
A lot of people say, he was just a Platonist who doesn't really care about the body and material things. And this part of the treatise on prayer kind of gives a different side to that.
Mm-hmm.
But he's also very careful. He says, don't think that because you do that, you're better than everybody else.
Right.
And it kind of reminds me of, I hate advertisements. Marketing can be so disgusting. And I remember this picture that was on the homepage of the Archdiocese of Minneapolis, St. Paul. And I think they're trying to market, their product to younger Catholics, teens, early 20s. And so they had a picture of, a young man and a young woman kneeling in a pew and praying like this. It's just, that is so manufactured. It's just, don't treat prayer like that. It's not good. And so, when clearly, I think there must have been people who were putting their prayer on display. And it probably drove people like Origen nuts that there were those who were trying to show off in front of everybody else.
Right.
To go back to Irenaeus, it is a little surprising that he doesn't have, any theological treatment of the subject of prayer. I mean, he was a bishop, correct? Bishop in Lyon. So he had a formal ministerial function. But it just kind of makes one wonder. And I think you said, being one of the earliest Christian writers to have a substantial literary output, you don't really see anything on prayer prior to the early 3rd century.
Well, and part of the reason I am surprised by it, I am and I'm not, I suppose. Against Heresies, his big work there is so focused on its polemical concerns. He doesn't really take a whole lot of breaks to say, oh, let's talk about this for a bit. Let's break off. And he does go on tangents, but it's almost all really to contribute to his purpose of countering the heretics.
Mm-hmm.
and their specific, issues. So I guess if his concern with them was not about prayer first and foremost, it's obvious from what he says that he assumes prayer.
Mm-hmm.
It's an assumed practice. But yeah, no, he doesn't lay down a lot in terms of um, a theology of it.
Mm-hmm.
But there was, I mean, he did inherit some literature that, the Didache, for example,
Mm-hmm.
uh, has a fair amount to say of practices and when and where.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Clement of Rome had a little bit to say. So there had been some, but yeah, he doesn't really expand on it. So
Well, there was a pretty early tradition of praying 3 times a day.
right.
I think they get that from the book of Daniel. And then there's some New Testament passages. I think there's one in Acts where Peter prays at midday. Is it Peter that prays at midday? I can't remember.
Ninth hour, I believe. Yeah.
The ninth hour, yeah.
Which I guess, yeah, is
And so there was this rhythm. Now, whether they all observed that, questionable. But that was a tradition. And there were usually times for psalmody, if I'm not mistaken, where they would chant psalms and hymns at those times, which is kind of a forgotten part of prayer when we talk about it these days, is the important role the psalms play.
Yeah, have you seen that little book by McGuckin?
No.
Trying to remember what it's called. It's something about the early church and praying the Psalms. And I think I have it on Kindle. I haven't read a whole lot of it, but yeah, he talks about that. And who else was I just reading about that? It seems. Do you have McGowan's book on worship in the early church?
No, it's on my Amazon wish list, but I don't have it.
Yeah, McGowan, he talks a little bit about how a lot of the early worship practices and spiritual rhythms of life argues, that most of them had roots in, their Jewish traditions that they inherited. That, like you mentioned, the Book of Acts, that you see there with, the first Christians going to the temple, going to the synagogue, potentially like the 3 times a day prayer, even the fasting. And Tertullian, actually, he talks about and how he would say that the Lord's Prayer really needs to serve as really the foundation of all prayer. So Tertullian, now I know we wanted to keep these guys rooted in time here. So Tertullian, just a wee bit after Irenaeus, so turn of the century.
Yeah, where did he die in, like 202 or something like that?
Irenaeus.
No, Tertullian.
I think he lasted a little longer than that.
Did he last a little longer than that?
220 maybe. Either way, just slightly younger contemporary. I guess. And so yeah, anyway, so all of those, especially in the 2nd century, they would talk about the Lord's Prayer and not just, as I understand it, as something to be just recited. What do you got there?
I got the 3 treatises on the Lord's Prayer: Tertullian, Origen, and Cyprian.
Oh, actually, I probably have that in my Logos. I forgot about that. Yeah, I haven't looked at that one yet.
But yeah, they kind of use the Lord's Prayer as a pedagogical device to teach people how to pray.
Yeah, which is interesting, isn't it? Because again, I don't know about your tradition, but in mine, it's
what tradition is that?
It's to be recited every once in a while, right? And
you have a tradition?
Well, for what it is, yeah. Well, even the congregation I'm with now, their practice, for example, was always at communion they would recite it together, and that would be about it. And it would get preached on, every few years or so. I'll work through it as a homily. But but I like that idea that Tertullian and the others talk about, is it sort of being a gateway, really, gateway prayer.
Well, it's kind of an obvious choice, right? If you're going to use a biblical text to teach people how one ought to pray, I mean, that's the most obvious one to go to, I would think.
Well, actually, and I think, sorry, you mentioned that little book that you pointed out there. I think in that treatise of Tertullian's, you mentioned the Psalms. I think I haven't read it well enough to really comment, but I think he talks about the Lord's Prayer as that foundation, and then uses the language of expanding outward even through the use of the Psalms. So that is very interesting, and how they use the Scripture as the basis of their prayers. Again, I know things are different in your papist world, but for us heretical Protestants, it's mostly you yourself and your own ideas of prayer, and very, very individualistic, and not always from the Scripture. So these are very helpful tools, I think.
Yeah, I mean, when you read monastic literature like Evagrius or John Cassian, they have quite a bit to say about the Psalter and how the rhythm of praying the Psalms cultivates a certain attitude and disposition, and it fits into the rhythm of the day. So for these monks in Egypt, it's work and prayer. That's really the twin axes around which their lives are rotating. And you have, John Cassian in book 10 of his Conferences talk about the kind of moving experiences a monk has when he hears a cantor or a choir chanting the Psalms, and the rhythm of the voices, and how it kind of moves and it stirs the soul. He says that the more you train yourself to pray the Psalms, the more the Psalms become your own prayer. So you really see this kind of monastic attitude towards almost making the text of the Bible your own words, your own prayer to God. And he says that the Psalter really kind of covers all the different human emotions and human experiences. There's anger, there's sadness, there's praise, there's lament, and all this stuff. But at one point, you see them dealing with this issue of distractions at the time of prayer. So they ask, I think it's Abba Isaac, it's the Abba that they are gathering around for these discourses on prayer. So all these monks would kind of congregate around an elder and ask them questions, and then the elder would kind of give a lengthy discourse on a particular subject. And this time it was on prayer, and they said, we know that Paul tells us to pray unceasingly in First Thessalonians or something like that, I think is where that is. And he said, but I don't really know how, because I always get distracted. And Abba Isaac said, well, there's a biblical formula that I'm going to give you, and you're going to pray this all the time. You're just going to chant it over and over again. And he uses Psalm 70, verse 1, God, come to my assistance, or Lord, make haste to help me, which is the intro to our evening prayer. And he says, within that one biblical verse, you have everything you need. Because you will be taught that there is never a time in your life when you don't need God's assistance with something. And the more you pray that, if you pray it constantly, when you're working, when you're at psalmody, when you're this and that, you're going to be even saying it in your dreams. You get this notion, that it's just repeated all day constantly, and you could kind of imagine what impact that would have. If you think about like athletes, think of how many times Sidney Crosby has had to do certain physical trainings and how that conditions his body to perform on the ice, and it almost becomes second nature to him. I mean, it's a very similar thing in the monastic practice of prayer, that it's just kind of becoming part of who you are.
Yeah. Have you read that novel, The Pilgrim's Way?
The Pilgrim's Tale.
Pilgrim's Tale, is that what it's called?
The Way of the Pilgrim. My supervisor did the translation of it for the Classics of Western Spirituality.
Oh yeah.
The Jesus Prayer.
Yeah.
That comes out of the monastic tradition.
Right. You didn't actually answer my question, I know.
Yes. Well, I thought that my intelligent remark,
Oh, is that what that was?
implied that I had read it. Yeah, I did. Have you read Franny and Zoe?
Hold on. Let's talk about the first one first. Just calm down.
Well, Franny and Zoe is about the Jesus Prayer. It's about the Pilgrim's Tale.
Okay. So no, I haven't read Franny and Zotar or whatever, but I read the Pilgrim's Tale just this year, actually. Found it at Value Village, as a matter of fact, and quite enjoyed that. And even just how the story of the pilgrim,
Russian pilgrim, right?
Russian pilgrim,
This
right?
is in Russia, 19th century?
Yeah, and just how his story really embodies exactly like you were talking about, the distractions, the challenge of prayer, and as you said, I think his story was that exact verse. He was trying to understand it, how to pray without ceasing. So yeah, very interesting.
But he has a different approach to that, right? Of how to pray without ceasing. He uses a different prayer. So what's the Jesus prayer?
Well, he uses maybe, I think, what it was a primitive form of the Jesus prayer. It's basically the same, just Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me.
Yeah.
And omitted the sinner part, I think.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, very similar though.
But not everybody who's watching this, because remember, we have millions of avid viewers out there who might not know what the Jesus prayer is.
Right.
Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner.
Right. Well, and actually, just to let you know, I just checked, and no one's watching because you have it set on private right now. Sad, but you can fix that when we're done. So you'll just have to publish it as public. But for now, it's just you and I.
I'm an idiot.
I told you to let me do it, but no, you said you had it figured.
Growing pains, Don. Growing pains.
That's all right. It'll publish public. That's fine.
There's something else too with prayer. I think it kind of gives an important window into early Christian thought, and that's the distinction between apophatic and cataphatic theology. So the apophatic, the negative theology, can't really make any positive statements about God because God can't be circumscribed. And cataphatic, more of a positive theology, characterized by somatic experience, sensation, this and that. And it really emerges in the Egyptian desert as a source of tension in the monks. So as I talked last time a little bit about Abba Serapion and his inability to pray without giving God some kind of human form.
Right.
And so much of that tension in the Egyptian desert anyways was rooted in the persistence of pagan practices that were still going on in Egypt. And the monks, as nice as they were, at around this time, they were destroying pagan temples and knocking down pagan altars and this and that. So paganism was still quite a thing that they were concerned with at the time. And the pagans would often have like material objects, little statues, little trinkets that they would use to help them out.
Yeah, I saw Gladiator. I remember.
You remember that little guy, that little the little family that he had? That's real.
Absolutely.
That's real.
Everything I learned about Greco-Roman culture was from Gladiator.
Russell Crowe.
Yeah.
Uh, but it was a real, source of tension. I mean, it almost got violent at times in the desert, whether or not they should be depicting God, with these mental images. And Evagrius was like, no, that's a distraction, and that's kind of a source of pride, and it's your inability to move beyond anything of sense perception. But then there are some who are perfectly fine with talking about prayer as, the experiential aspect of prayer. So Evagrius will talk about pure prayer or true prayer as he'll use images of light, calls it a seraphic light, but not really with any language of sense. Whereas John Cassian, writing quite a few decades later, who was a student of Evagrius, but knows that Evagrius was viewed with quite some suspicion by the time Cassian is writing. Instead of imageless prayer, he'll talk about wordless prayer or fiery prayer. So he kind of gives it something of a somatic language a little bit. He won't use imageless, and he won't talk about, he won't be completely apophatic. He kind of brings a cataphatic element into it, which makes reading him actually quite appealing, because you can kind of relate to him. Evagrius can be very abstract at times. Very good. I like Evagrius quite a bit, but pretty abstract, whereas Cassian gives it a real human element.
How about, have you read much of Dionysius? Do you find him easy entry level?
I mean, he was an idiot. Just kidding. I haven't really read much of him. No, I haven't gotten much into him at all. Or Maximus, for that matter. I really haven't read much of Maximus the Confessor either.
Well, we don't know anyone that likes him, so no worries about that.
Nobody that matters anyway.
No, I should remember better, but you know how it is when you're reading so much at once. But
thought you were going to say when you get old.
Well, that too. But that volume of essays that we were putting together about Ascent to the Divine.
What do you mean that you were putting together? I thought you've already submitted it.
Yeah, it's with the publisher, so hopefully we'll see it this year. So it's not specifically on prayer, all of the essays, but some of them definitely talk about it. But even as you're talking about, no, I don't think we have a chapter on Cassian, but definitely Evagrius and Maximus.
Who wrote the one on Evagrius? If you have to look it up, don't worry about it.
Yeah. I was going to say, is that Despina's chapter?
Oh, yeah, she might have.
Yeah. Kevin definitely is Maximus, our friend Kevin Clark. And
K-Ball.
And Jonathan Zecker does, he does Climacus. So he does On the Ladder of Divine Ascent.
Yeah, okay. Mm.
And Andrew Louth does Dionysius. So yeah, I think it's just we have I think Evagrius must be Despina. Anyway, so like I say, I wish I could remember all the fellows, but you know how it is.
Yeah. I know it's like your brains are scrambled.
I'm losing. You're editing furiously, so I can't quite remember. But no, I mean, if you think about a few takeaways from all this. I don't know if it's time for us to wrap up here or not, John. I'm not sure, but
probably pretty close. We're getting close to 9 here.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that strikes me about all of these different writers we've talked about is you certainly don't see the disconnect, do you? That sometimes, you'll find in contemporary scholarship, where, to talk about the interface of theology and prayer, it's not terribly frequent or common that you'll see it. But certainly it was, even for Origen, the guy writing at a level beyond what anyone had ever seen in the church. Even he is writing tracts about prayer. And it was an assumption of the basic rhythm of their life that it was. And I think partly that is it for Irenaeus, right? That he didn't really write about it because it just was, a regular part of his routine. So I don't know that that's always the case today. I think it's something potentially that we can learn from, for sure.
Well, at least in the Roman Catholic Church, the liturgy of the hours, the cycle of praying the Psalms 3 times a day is, that's for religious communities, monastic and mendicant communities. You don't get it much in parishes. You don't even get it in more apostolic orders, more missionary-oriented orders. Another thing, too, I think, that the modern world, for the last 200-300 years, we've really developed kind of an individualistic mentality, kind of an atomistic view of the world. And we forget sometimes, I think, the connection between prayer and ethics, or prayer and ethics and the liturgy. I just get a sense, and of course, I don't have any empirical evidence to support this, but I just get the sense that for a lot of people, prayer is like, yeah, it's me time. I just have to go and say 5 Our Fathers and 5 Hail Marys, or pray the Rosary once, and that's it. But and I guess that's better than nothing. But at the same time, I think we've lost sight of the connection that, if we're going to present ourselves to God at the time of prayer, we should probably do a little house cleaning first. If I'm going to invite guests over, I'm going to make my bed at least and do my dishes. Why not, mend some relationships before you go talk to God?
Yeah, I like that. I also like what you were saying about, or who the writer we were talking about. And even, if you think about the difference between our own traditions, and if one looks at the other and says, oh, you need a little more depth and regularity, and if the other side says, oh, you need a little bit more freedom and spontaneity, what I like about these texts that we've talked about is, even again with Tertullian, being rooted in the words of Christ, in the scripture and the Psalter, and then coming out of that foundation and being authentic and heartfelt and personal with your prayers, both as individuals and as communities, as many of those early texts were addressing.
Well, if you think about it, the personal element is certainly primary to an extent, because people like Origen and Evagrius and Cassian, probably Tertullian, think that prayer is, it's the most intimate time you have with God, and Origen talks about it. Lorenzo Perone, in his book, which is about 700,000 pages,
wow,
but it's a wonderful book. He talks about the heart for Origen. He calls it the organ of prayer, because it's the location where, at the time of prayer, God is kind of working his healing remedies, and it's where he's testing the conscience of the one praying. And as personal as that is, Origen is very emphatic about this, and he takes it from the Our Father. He's, when he does a verse by verse interpretation of it, and when he gets to forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are indebted to us, he has a pretty lengthy and a very fantastic discourse on the kinds of obligations we have to each other. And knowing human limitations and human frailty, we so often neglect or abuse those duties and oftentimes do wrong to each other. And prayer, especially the Lord's Prayer, reminds us that we need to mend those relationships. And I just, it's something that probably needs to be emphasized more than anything else in the world today, where we're so divided in our politics and ideology, religion, so many divisions, so many ways in which we kind of demonize people with whom we disagree. And I think remembering that, as baptized believers, we have certain obligations to treat each other in certain ways and to speak with each other in certain ways. They have a lot to teach us, I think.
I agree. In prayer and in so many areas.
Yeah.
The wisdom of the fathers.
And they didn't always live up to their ideals, but they're good ideals, and they're worth striving for. And we can't. There's no wishful thinking that people like Origen or Irenaeus were impeccable in everything that they did. They were flawed just like everybody else, but the ideas they espoused are ideals that are worth striving for us today.
Yeah.
For them back then.
For sure. Have you read that comment? Maybe we've even talked about this, that C.S. Lewis made in his preface on the Incarnation.
No.
Yeah, for some reason C.S. Lewis wrote a preface to Athanasius, a volume. But it's actually, especially if you're Protestant, it's because people love C.S. Lewis.
So do we.
Oh, great. So it's a great little couple of pages. And one of the things that he says, he doesn't specifically say the fathers, but he says something about like the old books.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, why do we read the old books? And he says, it's not because they're necessarily any better than us or had it right where we have it wrong. But he said, like you just pointed out, they too were, broken men and women, made their mistakes. But he says, but they weren't our mistakes. They didn't see things the same as we saw. And so reading the old books and their perspectives is like a fresh, it's very beautiful the way he expresses it. I can't remember exactly, but it's like a fresh, clean breeze that can blow in for us. And again, essentially it's not only a different perspective, but I think you and I would probably agree that a lot of what these individuals are writing about, they are coming at it not only from that different vantage point, but they're digging in a lot more than is often the case around us. And there's a depth there, but also praxis as well. And
I would love it if you never used that word ever again.
Love? Sorry.
Praxis.
Let me take a note of that. Okay. Duly noted. Never say it again. I should
apologize before we end our stream for saying that snide little remark.
I'm never
sure
will.
Our relationship is on good terms. Praxis.
All right. Jeez. Sign it off and let's get out of here.
Do you have any ideas for what you want to do next time? Any topics that we should be talking about?
I had some, but I can't think of it now.
Yeah, that's nice. All right. Well, we'll wrap it up.
We'll think of something.
Yeah, we'll think of something.
Awesome.
Great, Donnie boy.
All right. Don't forget to publish this so